I now call the member for Ballina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to also contribute to the debate on the Retirement Villages Amendment Bill 2020, and we do commend the Minister for this bill. And we know that there are 66,000 people over the age of 55 living in more than 550 retirement villages across New South Wales. And Mr Speaker, nearly 50% of the Ballina electorate are actually aged over 55. And aged care, including accommodation, is a huge industry, and it also a big focus of our community, and rightly so. And as we've heard today, increasingly we are an ageing population. I'm certainly on that trajectory, and like all of us, and so making sure that these are fit, that these are homes where people can come and go and change their circumstance without ridiculous and outrageous consequences of that. Retirement villages provide a unique opportunity for community and for freedom, in addition to the very practical benefit that comes from the cost of buying into a retirement village, which is often a fraction of the cost of buying an equivalent home outright. Although we have seen that sometimes the burden of that in terms of the infrastructure in the village, there's a minority of unscrupulous operators, that can become very, very onerous. We know that the government commissioned a Griner report into the retirement village sector, which was an indictment on the exploitative practices of a minority, but it was exposed by the ABC. The Greens are pleased to see that the government is continuing to put those recommendations of the Griner report into practice. This bill is an excellent step, but it is certainly not the end of ensuring current and former retirement village residents are given the protection that they deserve. And as I say, Mr Speaker, there are 7 retirement villages in the Ballina electorate. And I know I was at the opening of the Palm Lakes village, which is honestly, it is like something I've seen in the, it's like a theme park. It's extraordinary. They've got their own bowling alley, and I know that in my electorate that on the whole the operators do a great job. But we did see from the Griner report that unfortunately a minority do not, and that the impact on some of the most vulnerable people in our community, when taken advantage of, compels us to ensure that our laws are stronger. And that brings me to this bill. We know that this bill comprises 3 main amendments to the Retirement Villages Act 1999. That's the 42-day current charges cap, the exit entitlement order, and the aged care rule. With regard to the 42-day recurrent charges cap, where a former retirement village resident would be required to pay recurrent charges beyond 42 days if they were having difficulty selling the property or their circumstance, they may be in hospital, there are a whole raft of reasons. And of course, can you imagine the stress of just racking up those costs? Previously, former residents who are registered interest holders were required to continue to pay recurrent charges until the premises sold or a new resident entered into a contract. So we welcome the fact that that in particular, Mr Speaker, I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, I've just lost my place. That being indefinitely liable for maintenance and service costs, council rates and insurance for your former residents when you're also paying for your current residence, whether that is aged care, a private home or elsewhere, is an extraordinary burden which people do not deserve. So the 42-day recurrent charges cap is very welcome. The exit entitlement order, which allows a former occupant to apply to the Secretary of the Department of Customer Service for an exit entitlement, will provide for this, to force the operator to pay the former occupant's exit entitlement where there's been an unreasonable delay on the sale of the premise. This is welcome also. Where the premises has remained unsold for 6 months in metropolitan areas and 12 months in regional areas. Formerly, residents were not entitled to be paid their exit entitlement until the premise was sold, no matter how long the sale took. The Greens, And the third one, Mr Speaker, is the aged care rule, which allows former residents moving into aged care to request the retirement village operator to pay the former residents' aged care daily accommodation payment, with this being deducted from their exit entitlement. And that's obviously to do in connection with aged care facilities that are on site as well as the retirement village. Under this proposed legislation, former residents will not be able to trigger both the aged care rule and an exit entitlement order. Mr Speaker, the Greens are very pleased, and our spokesperson Abigail Boyd in the other place successfully, and we thank the Minister, successfully moved 4 amendments to this bill that, as I say, prevent retirement villages operators passing the costs they incur as a result of the and with regard to the 42-day recurrent charges, the Greens successfully were able to work with the Minister to make sure that that's not passed on unnecessarily to residents, to current residents. We also moved amendments to allow former residents to access both the aged care rule and the exit entitlement order rule, also to allow an exit entitlement order to be applied after 6 months in all instances, rather than 6 in metro and 12 in non-metro. And we also sought clarification for the period the operator has to sell the premises, and we sought to close a loophole which would delay the commencement of the period to the detriment of the former resident. Mr Speaker, in supporting this bill, the Greens also seek clarification from the government on a number of points, which we understand will be addressed further in the regulations. Firstly, we seek an indication as to how the regulations will define what does and does not constitute an unreasonable delay on the part of the village operator in the sale of a residence. While it is important to recognise the reality of demand on sale prospects, it is equally important that operators are not able to claim, for instance, that the possibility of a low sale price, that is the reason. Additionally, we seek confirmation from the government that independent valuers appointed by agreement of the former occupant and operator will be required to demonstrate independence as a requirement of their being appointed. It has been raised with the Greens that, particularly in regional areas, the pool of valuers from which to select is likely to be small, and former residents may feel pressure to agree to appoint a valuer whose independence they are not sure of if the alternative is not finding a valuer at all. So this is another burden that regional areas shoulder. For this reason, the Greens would like to see the regulations reflect the need for confirmation of independence by implementing a requirement that a stat dec confirming independence must be sought and must be completed by an independent valuer appointed by agreement between the former occupant and operator under Division 4, Section 182AI. And finally, Mr Speaker, the Greens seek clarification from the government on the prescribed period after which a former resident can apply for an exit entitlement order. We understand that the regulations will set the prescribed period at 6 months for metropolitan areas and 12 months for regional areas. We would like clarification as to how metropolitan and regional areas will be defined under the regulations. The Greens strongly support the 3 key reforms in this bill. The retirement village sector is in extreme need of overhaul. The bill begins the process of ensuring that older people do not need to worry about being ripped off or let down by the organisations that provide them access to rich and vibrant retirement communities. And Mr Speaker, it would be very remiss of me not to, with a year of a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, and how many people in my community, in our community, were incredibly nervous and had to stay away from their grandchildren and family members, and a whole raft of really awful, perverse outcomes of border closure and the pandemic itself. But just to acknowledge the resilience of my community, and to acknowledge the resilience of my community is one of the highest in the state for volunteerism, and that so many organisations, Mr Speaker, have continued to volunteer in COVID-safe ways throughout that time, and a big shout out to everyone living in aged care in the Ballina electorate, and we thank the Minister because what he is doing is will actually improve lives for people, and we like to see that every day in this place. Thank you.
Well, I thank the member for Ballina.